What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks in Marvel Snap. To start with, Arishem has started to adapt to a wider metagame. Now, this deck has been a deck that was so dominant and so played that mirror tech involved playing Darkhawk in your own deck that was weak to Darkhawk. This has gradually become less of an issue as the Arishem decks have included so many cards that are good against opposing Darkhawks that the Darkhawk mirror tech doesn't even end up being all that good anymore. This is represented in this version of the Arishem deck, which has removed that Darkhawk mirror tech, and as such, also the general weakness to Loki. And that means that this deck has a much more even matchup spread because Darkhawk wasn't very good in those matchups that were not mirrors. It was very much a card that you were running for those mirrors, and once it became not even very good there, thanks to, when you look at this deck, you can see at least 4 tech cards that are extremely good against it, between Echo and Alioth, getting rid of the ability if you have priority, the cards that remove it, like Rogue and Shang-Chi. You end up in a situation where running Darkhawk is a little bit worse than not running Darkhawk, and so you have a deck that looks like this. You end up having to choose between, I would say, one of 2 5-cost tech cards here. This list has chosen Leech. You can also choose Dr. Octopus. Whatever disruptive tool you feel like using on turn 5, you have the ability to include in your deck. And of course, by turn 5, I mean turn 4, because Arishem is an extremely balanced and reasonable Marvel Snap card. There's still a little bit up in the air for this, but basically I would say right now, the flex slots are Nocturne, and whatever you want to do in that Leech spot, and maybe your Echo spot can be a Quinjet if you really feel like it, but honestly, I think Echo is going to be much more impactful in a lot of different spots. The cards that are really locked in, I think at this point, the top end, Alioth and Blob, the Mockingbird, the Rogue, the Agent Coulson, the Loki, the Shang-Chi, those ones are really locked in, and of course, Arishem is locked in. The major exploration you're going to be doing is in the 3 or 4 remaining slots in this deck, and I do encourage you to try to do that, but I hope that you understand that a lot of the decisions in this deck are aimed at sort of very specific things. Obviously, Rogue and Shang, because a lot of people are playing Darkhawk, Echo, because they're trying to mystique the Darkhawk, Alioth, because they're trying to mystique the Darkhawk, and it suddenly starts to make a lot more sense when you look at it from there. One card that's become sort of my pet card in lists like this, but I haven't found a justification to include, is Absorbing Man. I actually just really like him. I think he's neat. Now that you don't have Mystique, because Mystique is no longer copying your Darkhawk, you don't have the Blob Mystique thing, I think Absorbing Man might end up actually being pretty interesting there. As far as this deck's position into the metagame, it is generally very strong, but one thing you should keep a lookout for when you play it is, oh, wait, I didn't have a good early game. Arishem actually is fairly dependent on having a reasonable early game. I know that sounds a little bit weird because it's also dependent on not getting Darkhawked and beating the Darkhawk, but when you have that reasonable early game, it really makes your Shang-Chi and your Rogue and your Alioth and your Echo a lot better into what your opponent is doing, even if that thing is Darkhawk, right? When you have priority, you can either remove the Darkhawk or prevent them from doubling it. And that is a lot of, I need a good early game, right? That is why good early game is important in this. So in a way, the cards you randomly generate are going to be something that you're going to have to snap and retreat based off of because of how they interact with the rest of your game plan. Getting that early tempo down so you have priority and are able to dictate terms to your opponents who are playing Darkhawk against you, it's actually quite important. Next up is Thena Hawk, which is just a fair, reasonable Darkhawk deck. If you're looking for a Darkhawk deck that doesn't really go out of its way to just play Darkhawk as a tech card and not really support it in any way, if you want an ethical Darkhawk deck, I think this is the most ethical Darkhawk deck you can play. It's a very straightforward and very understandable deck. There are multiple directions you can go with it, but I think this one ends up being the one that makes the most sense to me because you are no longer as advantaged as you were playing a Hope Summers into a final turn Darkhawk Mystique into the Arishem decks because of their inclusion of Echo, because of their inclusion of Alioth. That has become a less reliable method of winning. Now you just want to play a little bit of an ethical game plan, and there's enough non-Arishem that you are incentivized to invest in making your Darkhawk and your Mystique real cards in other matchups. This uses the best points package in the game of Thena, Angela, and Kitty Pryde, and that associated pairing with Ravonna Renslayer and Sage, and weds it to a Mystique Darkhawk package that also synergizes with your Iron Man, which goes with your Ravonna. Very straightforward, very clear as to what this deck is trying to do. Your major flex slot is Juggernaut. I think Cosmo is actually a pretty interesting one here because Cosmo is so good into various Alioth things. Or not necessarily Alioth things, Arishem things. You can prevent your stuff from getting Alioth. You can prevent their blob from going on a specific lane. Like, it's not the world's worst idea, especially as more people are picking up Wong decks as well. Cosmo is an interesting inclusion here. The reason I have not included Cosmo is because you are still a Sage deck. I do think that once you start including Cosmo in here, you start thinking, maybe I don't want to be a Sage deck anymore, and that leads to a series of cascading changes. Ethical Hoops is what I would describe this deck as. This is the ethical Darkhawk list. It uses what it has in order to compete with everything, not just Arishem. This is a deeply unethical Loki deck, and it is using Loki's ability to get rid of useless tech cards in order to just randomly play a Darkhawk, right? One of the major upsides that Loki has always had as a strategy is that you just get to play whatever tech card you want, and then in the games where that tech card isn't useful, you can convert that tech card into something that is an actual card, thanks to the card Loki. Now, I'm not sure if you asked me to stack this up between this build and Blink Loki, which one you would recommend, which one I would recommend necessarily. However, I do think that right now, it is fairly important to actually have that Darkhawk tech in your Loki deck, because so many of the Darkhawk decks are cutting their own, or so many of the Arishem decks are cutting their own Darkhawk, and that means that your Loki's a little bit worse against them than it otherwise would be. With them cutting their own Darkhawk, if you keep running into people doing this, Quinjet does become a more important piece of what you're doing as a Loki deck. You are no longer free winning off of the Loki, but you still are able to have a reasonable early game into massive discounts. And if you can pull that off, something like Quinjet, Coulson, Loki is still going to be very strong into the Arishem decks, whether they're running Darkhawk or not. And that is an important thing to note. Like, I don't think this deck necessarily needs to be a Darkhawk Devil Dinosaur deck, but I do like that it's taking advantage of what Loki is doing already naturally by running Darkhawk and saying, okay, if I run into the matchup where this is good, it's going to be really good. And then with Devil Dinosaur saying, if I have the ability, now I want to have the ability to beat a deck without just playing Loki. I want to be able to just play a large unit and see where that takes me. I do think that a deck like Bloki is a very reasonable alternative to this, the Blink Loki list. You don't need to be building like this. The Bloki list is always one that I've found more appealing than others because I just enjoy playing out Loki games, but I do think it's a very valid alt on this list. A pretty simple substitution. All you got to do is cut the top end cards, play a Blink instead, and put another smaller card into the deck. One of the main methods of combating this metagame has been with clog decks, and I think that we have conclusively arrived at this point at a very much highly played shell, the Dagger clog list, and I think it's a good, reasonable, solid deck, but I think at this point a lot of people know what's going on with it, which does give the Dagger stuff a little bit less of a surprise. One thing that you're going to want to look at when you're playing this deck is understanding that people are probably going to be expecting Dagger out of this list at this point, and seeing if there's other things you can do. For example, I've lost to someone playing Shang-Chi and then dragging the Shang-Chi over with a Ghost Spider. Doing weirder stuff that your opponent might not be calculating for is actually fairly important with a deck like this. I do think that it's possible I'm overstating like how much people know what is going on in this deck. It's possible that lower down on the ladder, that doesn't end up actually being true. But in my experience, I certainly know if someone's playing like a Dr. Octopus deck, that there's a very reasonable chance I'm going to get daggered at some point in the game. And so that means that my final turn needs to be aware of something like Dagger, Ghost Spider plus Shang-Chi, right? That's something that I need to be aware of if we're going into a turn 7 thanks to the card Magic. This is a deck that is a little bit hard to win a lot of cubes with, if that makes sense. It's a deck that is very much coasting on win rate and trying to force your opponent out of the game and winning those small type of games. It's almost Galactus-esque, where your opponent almost always knows when they're going to lose when you're playing a deck like this, because they are distinctly aware of the options you have at your disposal. If you're in a bunch of situations where you're like, oh, well, I'd lose to a Shang-Chi here, you're probably going to lose to a Shang-Chi out of this deck. That is how it works. Now, the things that are actually keeping this deck afloat are actually the tech cards like Shang-Chi. Like, when you clog up one lane and then you have a Shang-Chi for another lane, you are almost always going to win these games. It's a very, very powerful strategy. One thing that I do want to point out in a deck like this that I assume a lot of people already know, but I don't want to make that assumption to the exclusion of others. When you play Titania, what you're going to want to do a lot of the time is play her alongside another Clogger. So on turn 4, you play Titania and Green Goblin in that order. Green Goblin goes over, then Titania triggers and goes over. The same works with White Widow. You play Titania and then White Widow. The on reveal happens first, and then Titania flips over there. If you can fill up a lane with Titania in the 4th slot, that is almost always a guaranteed victory. I know many people will be surprised to see Hydration Robert, often abbreviated as Hydra Bob, on this tier list. I don't think you need to buy Hydra Bob for this. This is a list I actually did a video on with Yo Woody, a very solid, very powerful list of Dracula dump. I can tell you when I played this list, it was one of the few decks that I played that I actually felt like, oh, I am reasonably very good into Arishem without having to run Darkhawk. I just end up naturally being a good matchup for that deck a lot of the time. The downside of this list is that there are some really finicky draws in it. Your good draws are really, really difficult for anything to beat. Your bad draws involve you doing a lot of nothing. This is definitely a deck where if you're not in sort of the median of luck, you can run into a lot of games where you're just sort of looking at like a hand of cards that simply does not put power on the board, or a hand of cards that is only power, but you don't have any of the enablers that actually make that happen. Hydra Bob is a fairly important part of this deck. Like, he is definitely a good card in his slot. You are able to move him around with your snaps. It does change how you approach your snapping, because now your snap is a resource to affect the battlefield. Very unique and interesting card. However, if you don't have him, you can replace him with Ant-Man. All you're really going to be losing is the ability to have like some priority games, and that isn't nothing. Like, to be clear, this is a deck that is sometimes playing for priority so you can Cosmo something. Your plan into Phoenix Force matchups is very much, I'm going to play for priority, I'm going to Cosmo the thing that they're going to use to blow up the Multiple Man or the Human Torch. That's how you play those matchups. And so you have like Squirrel Girl for that, you have Hydra Bob for that, you have Martyr for that. All of that stuff does work. It is a little bit worse if you replace Hydra Bob with Ant-Man, because then you are no longer as guaranteed to be able to execute that game plan. And again, that's a fairly minor occurrence. It's not always, but sometimes it really does matter. Like, if you need priority going in on turn 4 because your opponent is going to play a Wong, you need to make sure you have priority. You play the Cosmo. This is the kind of thing that can matter. I do think people are a little bit free with saying, okay, you can replace Hydra Bob with Ant-Man. It won't be any worse in any situation. And I think, most of the time that is true, but there are some real situations where Hydra Bob is better here. I do not recommend that you buy Hydra Bob to play this deck, however, because for the purposes of this, there is no reason you should be spending 6,000 tokens on slightly better Ant-Man. Even if he is a little bit better, you should not be spending resources on a card that you can get for free, literal free, instead. I think that this is a very powerful deck. It genuinely is. Like, the ability to get rid of everything in your hand, very strong. But again, there is a lot of luck in this. Drawing the right cards, hitting the Infinite off of Dracula. I had a lot of trouble with that personally. So you are going to end up needing a fairly high tolerance for, I just got unlucky and I lost the 50-50, or I just got unlucky and I lost the 33%er, because you're going to be playing a lot of those games when you play a deck like this. Namora has roared back into the metagame, and I realize there is a build of this list that is a little bit different from the one that I'm showing you right now. Runs like White Widow and Green Goblin. I personally do think that this build is a little bit better in my experience with playing the deck. I enjoy having these cards and the cards they have access to. I think Echo is very important for preventing Cosmo, especially right now, because of the amount of Cosmos in the game. Cosmo has become one of the better tech cards right now, as people have started to twig on to the fact that when you play a Cosmo, your opponent can't blob that lane, they can't Mystique that lane, and that's where a lot of power in the current metagame comes from. And because of that, Cosmo ends up causing some splash damage to this Wong archetype as it happens. It's a very interesting situation, but it is a situation that is mitigated heavily by Echo. I also prefer having cards like Nightcrawler in the deck and Sage in the deck. I think Sage especially is a very unique and powerful card in this list because it is able to be your go tall on a Wong lane card. A lot of the time, people will expect a very linear game plan out of you. They will expect you to play a Jeff and a Nocturne, a Wong, a Namora, and an Odin. And a lot of the time, they'll be able to do something that can beat that. And so in those situations, one of the things they'll often be planning for is 8 power in your Wong lane. And something that can really take them by surprise is having, 20 power in your Wong lane instead on that final turn of the game. That is definitely something you're going to want to keep in mind. The mix-ups between Sage and Odin are why this deck is so strong, in my opinion. Destroy is still a deck, and I think that that is a real testament to the power of a deck like this to just be able to exist, to have good locations, to make it be something that has survived from basically the beginning of Marvel Snap to now. Destroy has consistently existed the whole way through, and I just think that's an amazing thing to happen. Now, as far as the actual deck, there's usually just one tech slot. Mine is currently using Shang-Chi. Other options are Lady Deathstrike and Arnim Zola. Personally, I think Shang-Chi ends up being the more important option here because of the amount of decks playing Sasquatch, because of the amount of Arishem decks playing Blob. You're going to run into reasonably Shang-Chi-able targets a lot of the time, and I think that is an important thing to note. We were in a metagame that was pretty anti-Shang-Chi. For the first time ever, he was really not looking that good. Now we are back in a metagame where there's just a lot of good hits for this guy. He ends up being quite important. As far as minutia of playing Destroy, the one play tip I have for you, if you haven't played this deck before, is you are going to want to make sure you understand your energy management and what your final turn looks like. If you have a null and you're building up a Deadpool, well, if you don't get that X23 out there, you're not going to be able to play both of them on the final turn, which means you're going to want to play that Deadpool on turn 5 and actually just leave it out there a lot of the time, which means there is some associated risk with that, because what if they are able to blow that up? What if they are able to Shadow King it? What if they are able to do something about that? You have to be planning your turn 6 the entire game when you play a deck like this, and it's part of why X23 is so important in the list, because she enables your turn 6 to be much more powerful than otherwise. Your dream turn 6 is the world's largest Deadpool, and of course a null and a death. That is your end game. It's what this deck wants to do. It's what everyone wants to do with it. Please keep that in mind. You are going to need to plan out your turn 6 as you sort of make your way through the game, and that is why X23 is so strong in the list. The Thena negative list seems a little bit too hard metagamed for a previous metagame than this one. This is a deck that was good for like the first few days of Arishem, but has fallen back a little bit in my opinion, as Arishem has adapted Echo, as Arishem has adapted Eliath. As these cards have become more prominent, it ends up being a deck that is just very often behind on priority, very often going for a final turn Darkhawk Mystique in that matchup, and very often getting stopped by one of their priority things that stops that. Now, it's still a Mr. Negative deck, and that still is extremely, extremely powerful. It's just a little bit less heavy on the actual free roll Mr. Negatives. Like, this is a deck that does price you into, okay, I have the turn 3 Mr. Negative, I have to snap it. And a lot of that is going to be, did I draw stuff that I wanted to draw afterwards? Like, if you have the cards that Mr. Negative wants to hit in there, you do end up in a bit of a pickle. Now, that said, there are other builds of Mr. Negative that I also like. For example, you can simply play traditional Mr. Negative, which is much more straightforward in terms of your snap and retreats. There's a lot less nuance in it. You snap your negatives, you chain, you draw a million cards, you win the game. It's actually very, very, very powerful at this point in time because of the flexibility of a card like Arnim Zola under a negative. You end up being able to like double Shang-Chi or triple Shang-Chi even. You end up being able to like move Iron Men around the board. There's just a lot of power that you can wield. And I do think that a lot of the setup in a deck like this is going to be, all right, if I have the negative in the Jane, how do I set up such that I do not make my Arnim Zola a 50-50 later in the game? What is my methodology here? Am I able to make plays that beat Alioth in matchups against decks that have Alioth? Am I able to make plays that beat Echo? Am I able to make plays that beat what my opponent is trying to do? A lot of time you won't have to worry about that because you just simply won't have done your combo. But when you do your combo, I do want you to sit there and think, okay, how do I lose this game? What are the things my opponent is likely to be doing? How am I going to beat what I expect them to do? This list got up to top 4, and the main thing it's attempting to leverage is just the traditional bounce lists have been very good at distributing power into the lanes where it's actually needed, and distributing as much power as possible into where it is actually going to win the game. That kind of dynamic is actually quite good right now, as the game has become a little bit more about haymakers. Arishem decks are playing blob, there's just a bunch of big numbers going on, and so when you have decks that are able to redistribute their power, you end up being able to sort of adjust on the fly to your opponent's game plan. Where they have invested a lot into one lane, you can say, okay, I don't want to be there anymore. I'm going to move my cards to a different lane. Or you can say, I do want to be there. I want to invest in that lane, and I want as many points as possible in it. That is sort of how you accrue card advantage in Marvel Snap, by either invalidating or making irrelevant the investments your opponent has made in a lane. By investing in a lane that they are going all in on, you are able to say, if I flip this lane, I will win the game. By removing your investment from a lane, you can say, actually, you have over-invested in that lane, and now I'm going to win your other 2 weaker lanes. That is typically how Bounce has managed to end up being a reasonable threat. And this deck is sort of the apex of how that approach looks in the current year. This is what bounce decks are sort of like. The platonic ideal of a bounce deck is what this deck is trying to be. There's no interaction. We're not Shadow Kinging. We're not Shang-Chiing. We're not doing any of that. What we're doing is point allocation. And we are playing a pure point allocation game. And the goal here is to allocate your points better and more efficiently than what your opponent is able to accomplish. Speaking of point allocation, there's a notable lack of Killmonger, which has freed Zoo up just a little bit, and that a bit of freedom has made it like, all right, like I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing Zoo, but you can play Zoo and you cannot feel terrible about it, and I think that's all right. Zoo has, now without the need to run Kyera, you are able to play a Nocturne, which helps you in these matchups against the Doc Ock decks, but fundamentally, that is the matchup that's gating you the most right now. There's a lot of Doc Ock, whether that be out of Arishem decks or out of dedicated Clog decks. You're just not good against a deck that really wants to clog you up. You're very bad into any deck that's running Magic. You're not built for anything other than a straightforward 6-turn game of Marvel Snap. And that is ultimately the undoing of this deck as like a fully top-tier competitor right now, because there are multiple decks that are breaking those rules. Arishem breaks it with energy and, of course, running Doc Ock and ruining your stuff. But Doc Ock decks break it with Magic, and so you just end up in these non-normal games, and Zoo is a deck that's built for normal games. Phoenix Force is one of the few decks that can feel very confident snapping into basically anything right now, and I think there's a real appeal to that kind of deck, where you're just like, you know what? I'm good. I'm going to be able to snap into this. It's going to be fine. I'm going to win. Now, again, there are a little bit more Cosmo gamers than there were previously. Those Cosmo gamers can really ruin your snaps. If you snap a multiple man and a Venom and a Phoenix Force, they take priority. They Cosmo your multiple man lane, you kind of get run over. And the same goes for your Shuri game plan. You know, you're snapping the Shuri, and they have a Cosmo for your Venom on the Nimrod on turn 6. That's definitely something you got to worry about. Like, the way I see it is you should basically always, if you have the option, you're doing a Shuri Nimrod thing, you should basically always go Spider the Nimrod to another lane. There is no reason not to do that at this point. That is, I think, what I would expect to be the base level of competency with a deck like this, is if you have Ghost Spider Nimrod, but Ghost Spider Venom Carnage, you need to Ghost Spider that Nimrod every single time. It's honestly going to matter a lot. You can also still play the Phoenix Force Loki deck. I think it is like borderline playable. It's hard for a deck with like as many free turn 4 wins as this to be like, oh, I hate this. It's actively bad. But I do think that like if I had to pick one of the Phoenix Force decks right now, I would pick the Nimrod one. That's the one that I think is more reliable, a little bit more powerful in a general sense. More ways of just really going over the top. And I think that most of the time this deck ends up being pretty solid regardless of what your end game is, because you're very much still a Phoenix Force deck. You're like, that's still plan A here. So you get to like sort of skate on doing the rest of this. I also think that right now it's a little bit worse to just be a Loki deck than it was even a week ago because of the Arishem decks removing cards like Dark Hawk from their midst, and because of the non-Arishem decks tend to be a little bit more setup heavy, right? Where you have like a Thena deck, an Angela deck, a Dark Hawk deck. You get the Dark Hawk, and you're suddenly sitting there looking at like their Dark Hawk where they've played a Korg and a Rock Slide, your Dark Hawk much smaller. And so there's just like a little bit more setup in the metagame that makes Loki feel a little bit less reliable as a backup plan compared to the Shuri Nimrod stuff, to me at least. Finally, I think I've seen some good stuff out of Silky Smoove recently, and I realize that's kind of crazy, but it actually makes sense if you bear with me. We talked about how good Shang-Chi is, right? This deck is functionally 100% un-Shang-Chiable. Yeah, okay, whatever. You'll Shang-Chi my Thena. Sure, right, okay. But there is something to this, right? And I think there's like a bit of a flex spot here. You can mess around with various things. One card that I really wanted to try to get in here is Nightcrawler. Because of Thena, I really feel like having that one energy card to play is quite important. I do think that it ends up being like, okay, maybe it's fine that we don't have it, but like I haven't felt too impressed with Vision, who ends up being hard to weave into our Thena game plan. I really care a lot about the Thena stuff, the Angela stuff. That's the stuff I really care about. And so, yeah, I think there's room for flexibility here, but fundamentally what this is saying is, hey, a lot of people are running Shang-Chi. A lot of people are running Enchantress or Rogue. What if we set up a situation where we are doing good points? We have our own Shang-Chi. We have a Mobius so we don't get Loki'd. And we are creating points onto the board. And we are totally unable to be tech carded because there's very few Shadow Kings in the meta right now. And that's really the only tech card that works against this deck if you're playing it right. I appreciate that kind of deck building. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for coming on this massive journey of deck lists with me. It has, as always, been a pleasure. I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And I'm hoping that you did if you made it this far, because if you didn't, I really don't know why you're still watching. Maybe I'm just pretty.